hearing her just once. She has published 10 books, including 4 books of poetry, and has won awards too numerous to mention. I'll just mention one, the Khushwant Singh Prize, the inaugural Khushwant Singh Prize at the Jaipur Literary Festival 2 years ago. And as far as prose books go, she published a book on Buddhism which was reprinted a few times. Even more spectacularly successful was her biography of Jaggi Vasudev, Sadhguru Jaggi Vasudev. She was born in Bombay. She obtained her master's degree in literature there. She worked for 15 years with the National Center for the Performing Arts. But she's a citizen of the world who has traveled far and wide, mainly to attend literary conferences and present her poems. Her work has been translated into several languages, including Hindi, Tamil, Italian, German, and Spanish. Today she'll take us through her poetic and spiritual journey. The title of her talk is "Give Me a Home That Isn't Mine." Now that's a line from one of her poems. Over to her.
I'm contemplating whether to use this mic or the handheld mic that I asked for. Is this all right? Can you hear me at the back?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhu. Thank you, Asha. It's always difficult to know where to begin. And when you have an introduction as comprehensive as the kind that Madhu gives, it often feels like there's very little else to say. I was just reading the introduction that he sent out, and I'm really not quite sure there's much to add. But I personally always feel like a bit of an imposter when I'm simply talking about poetry. I always feel much more myself when I'm reading a poem. I've been warned by Madhu that no one here is terribly interested in poetry. But I'm going to take the liberty of introducing myself to you in a poem. Madhu's done the rest in prose. Often in India, when we introduce ourselves, we actually tell each other where we come from. So let me tell you something about where I come from. I'll start with a poem, and then I promise to move on to conversation. This is a poem about the city that I grew up in, the city that I love, the city that I hate, the city that I've always felt ambivalent about. I'm often asked why, and I think that's true of any relationship with intimacy. The deeper the intimacy, the more mixed one's feelings are. So this is about Bombay, Mumbai, Bombay, a city with many names, many faces, where I live. I live on a wedge of land, reclaimed from a tired ocean, somewhere at the edge of the universe. Greetings from the city, of L'Oreal sunsets and diesel afternoons, deciduous with concrete, botoxed with vanity. City of septic magenta hair clips, of garrulous sewers and tight-lipped taps, of 80s film tunes buzzing near the left temple, of ranting TV soaps and monsoon melodramas. City racked by hope and bulimia. City uncontained by movie screen and epigram. City condemned to unspool in an eternal hysteria of lurid nylon dream. City where you can drop off a swollen local and never be noticed. City where you're a part of every inly soaked bhelpuri. City of the Mahalakshmi beggar peering up through a gorse bush of splayed limbs. City of dark alleys. City of mistrust. City of forsaken, tubelit rooms. City that coats the lungs, stiffens the spine, chills the gut with memory. City suspended between flesh and mortar and faux leather and delirium, where it is perfectly historical to be looking out on a sooty handkerchief of ocean, searching for God. What I'd like to do, really today, after having introduced you to this place to which I belong and unbelong all at once, I'd like to invite you to share with me just 3 moments. We don't have time for more, but I'd like to share just 3 moments from my life that have in many ways been pivotal in terms of my understanding of poetry. And if you don't care for poetry, let me say that they've been pivotal in terms of my understanding of language. And because language maps reality, they've been pivotal in terms of my understanding of my reality. And that's how, for me, this journey of poetry leaks into the spiritual journey. So the very first moment that I'd like to share with you is a moment that happened sometime when I was around 3 or 4, probably 3. I was just emerging into this verbal universe. I lived in Bombay, where, of course, one is born into this fabulous multilingual mess that is really worthy of celebration. So there was Tamil around me, there was English, there was Hindi, there was Malayalam. Outside of the city there was Marathi, there was Gujarati, Bambaiya, Hindi, which is a language unto itself. And of course at that age one doesn't really know where one language ends and another begins. So I had no clue. But I remember my earliest encounters with poetry. These weren't profound poems. These were just nursery rhymes in English, nonsense rhymes perhaps in Hindi or Tamil. I had no clue what was going on. You might remember The Owl and the Pussycat. Do you remember it? Nonsense verse by Edward Lear. The owl and the pussycat went to sea on a beautiful pea green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. This kind of absolute, absurd, delicious doggerel. And I remember listening to it, and the moment that I'd like to share with you is the sense of great wonder that I felt in the presence of this kind of patterning of language. There was a sense that poetry is a place where language behaves differently. This was not language that was staid and predictable and unsurprising in the way in which grown-ups spoke it. This was language that was capable of leaping from one place to the other without ever joining the dots. This was language that did not obey the same laws of gravity that governed adult grown-up prose. That was pedestrian language. That was language that walked. This was language that seemed kinetic. This was language that seemed buoyant. This was language that seemed to be straining to leap off the page. This was language that was dance. So I mention this here because it is so easy to forget this. It is so easy to start believing that the only thing that counts in language is meaning. And yet, who hasn't known this moment of absolute gobsmacked wonder when you see language behaving in all kinds of startling, dangerous ways? When it seemed to mean, and then it didn't seem to mean at all, and it didn't matter. Because this was dance. This was a kind of verbal choreography. You didn't ask for something as mundane as meaning. That's not why you went to this. You went to it with a deep sense of wonder. mention this here because it leads me inevitably to my second moment. And that was a moment that Madhu has actually shared, I realize, in the introduction that he sent around on email. This happened when I was about 12 or 13. I was right here in Madras, in my grandfather's home in CIT Colony, where I now live, on a summer vacation. It was one of those long, damp afternoons, and I remember pulling down a book by someone called T.S. Eliot. I had no clue who T.S. Eliot was, whether this was a man, whether this was a woman, whether he or she was important or unimportant, I knew nothing. I started reading a poem called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, I had no idea who Prufrock was, and I still don't. The point is that that was irrelevant. All I remember of that afternoon was this tremendous sense of homecoming. The sense that this is where I want to be for the rest of my life. Not because I understand what's going on. I have no clue what was going on. It was my first recognition of the fact that the place that you call home is a place that is familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And that's fine. That's really what you want. That's really what I was yearning for, I realized. The fact that I could recognize something even before I understood it. I responded to something. I didn't have an opinion. I didn't know whether this was good or bad. I just knew that I wanted to be here where there was sound and image and rushing air and music. I wanted to be here. And I responded without being able to decode what was going on. And I say this because later I was encouraged to believe that the universe I ought to live in was a fully decoded universe. But I actually remind myself of the fact that when I had these two moments happen in my life, I was filled with a sense of wonder because, in fact, I did not want to live in a fully decoded universe. I did not want to live in a place with 100-watt illumination. I wanted to live in a place that invited me to clarity, but also invited me to mystery. I wanted to live in a place of light and shadow. I did not want to have to choose between one and the other. But of course, school teachers would have us believe otherwise, right? I don't know how many of you remember school teachers asking you this question. What is the poet trying to say? Do you remember that? Yes? I think they've been asking this for generations. What is the poet trying to say? You read a poem in class, often together, and then, just when you feel the sense of excitement at some kind of galloping line, there comes this big, tiresome question. What is the poet trying to say? And with that comes, I think, two problems. One problem is, of course, the premise that the poet cannot say it. The poet can only try, right? And therefore, the poet is a somewhat fuzzy-headed creature who practices a juvenile form called poetry. And you who understand the superior form, which is prose, can decode what this fuzzy-headed individual intended to say. So that, of course, is one very sad premise implicit in this idea. What is the poet trying to say? The other premise is that the only thing that counts is meaning. The only thing that matters in language is meaning. That if I understand what the poet is trying to say, then I have pulled out, like extracting plums from a cake, I have pulled out what really counts, which is content. The rest of it, the music, the style, the form, the joy, the sensuous pleasure of language, all of that doesn't count. It can be tossed aside. And with with that, I really do think, comes a very ancient split between form and content, between music and meaning, between sound and semantics, between style and substance. And that split is never fully healed, which is why I suspect many of us in this very room have written poems at the age of 16, at least one poem. No one can cross the age of 16 without having written at least one poem. Love poem, usually. Sometimes in blood. Or we've at least been the recipient of those. No one can cross the age of 16 without doing that, because that's the way one's emotional thermostat works. It seems to call for poetry. And yet we forget. And we forget because there is this underlying assumption that somewhere poetry is something we don't understand. Who encouraged us to believe so? I believe generations of school teachers, by asking this particular question that marks the death knell of our love of poetry. I often draw consolation from this line from Randall Jarrell, the American poet and critic. He says that it's not that people have stopped reading modern poetry because they find it difficult. He says it's because we've stopped reading modern poetry that we find it difficult. And I think there's an insight there. And it's an invitation to reclaim for ourselves a form that's just waiting to be rediscovered. I actually believe that we live in a world today that encourages us to believe that there are just two kinds of language. There's the language of meaningfulness, and there's the language of meaninglessness. There's the language of terminal earnestness, and there's the language of terminal triviality. So on the one hand, you have the language of fact, the language of opinion, the language of slogan, the language of ideology, the language of theology, the language of manifesto, of scripture. And on the other hand, you have the other language, the language of sound bites, the language of trivia, the language that gives us pleasure, but we know it's essentially vacuous, and we turn to it for enjoyment, but we don't expect more. I think between these two very polarized options, there is a third option. And that for me has always been the language of poetry. Because poetry invites you to meaning, but it is also an invitation to a reprieve from meaning. And it's that oscillation between meaning and the absence of meaning that is the joy of poetry. You don't have to try too hard to respond to it. You are intrinsically and innately capable of doing that. And with that, I will move to my third moment. I was writing poetry. I was making what I thought of as significant personal discoveries about language. I realized that if you apply great heat and pressure to language, its chemical properties change. It's a strange substance, language. I realized that if you pull it out of one context into another, and you dim the house lights, and you bring on a spotlight, and you throw language up in the air, language can turn magical, it can turn performative. So I thought I was making very important discoveries about language as a chemical. But perhaps it's a bit naive, or perhaps a bit arrogant, to believe that you can experiment with a chemical as explosive, as molten as language, and not get scorched. So there came a time in my life when I got scorched. I tumbled headlong into what I now describe as a blank space on a page of poetry. It's what Madhu described in his introductory note as the near-death experience of 1997 in my life. I'm not quite sure how to talk about that experience, and the only reason I mention it here is because it was, when I look at it now, it was for me an encounter with wordlessness, a place where language, the one thing I had prized all my life to rescue me, just couldn't enter. And I was terrified. And when I started emerging from that particular experience, the one thing that I did know was that a poem is not just about words. A poem is also about blank spaces. All those blank spaces on a page of poetry have a significance. There is a reason why they exist. They may not mean something, but they mean very deeply. They are in fact the source of the poem's life energy. And I think that was the point at which my own spiritual journey began more consciously. It was the year 97, and 7 years later, I met Sadhguru. And the one thing I do remember about my early meetings with Sadhguru was this. To go back to what I said earlier, you sometimes know in your life that you have recognized the importance of something without knowing what it means. You know it's significant, you know there's a discovery there, you don't know what it means. I think that's how I felt when I encountered Sadhguru. And later I drew some, for me, the image, there was a particular image that he used, a very unsentimental image that often made sense to me later. He talks of the disciples, the seeker's relationship with the master, or with a guide, a spiritual guide. And he says it's a bit like the roots of a plant moving towards water. It's not an emotional journey. It is not a psychological journey. It is not a sacred journey. It is not a profane journey. It is just life recognizing life. And that particular image stayed with me. And in many ways it helped me understand what was going on in my own life. And when my own journey deepened, I think it was really about making my peace with those blank spaces, making my peace with those holes in one's life, those big gaping holes, which are inevitable. One can try to fill up those holes, of course, with more narrative. One can fill up those holes with more WhatsApp, with more politics, with more pasta, whatever. But the fact is, those holes exist, and they derail one inevitably at some point in one's life if one doesn't start addressing them. So I think that's what that journey began to mean, and that's what that spiritual journey has meant. That I began in a very dim way to understand what the poet Rilke might have meant when he talked of the muse that is always arriving out of silence. I think I began to have a glimmer of what that might have meant. I wrote a biography of Sadhguru some years later, and I'm not sure there's time enough to talk about that. Maybe we can in our discussion. But what I will say before I conclude is just this. That I actually thought much of my life, or I was encouraged to believe, that I turned to poetry for the meaning of it. I didn't. Likewise, I wasn't really on a spiritual journey for the meaning of life. I thought that was what my spiritual journey was about, that I was looking for the meaning of life. But I realized that what I was always actually looking for was a deeper, fuller, richer, more exuberant experience of life itself. And to me, that's where the poetic journey and the spiritual journey converge. That's where they meet. I think I should stop here. I'm fine with pausing for a while, and only if there are questions or